whether you wear a badge or not. If you care about courage, clarity, discipline, and the price of decisions in the moment that define lives, you've come to the right place. This is where training meets consequence, where the law collides with human behavior, and the fog of uncertainty tests the limits of reason. These are the stories of pressure, of purpose, and what it means to hold the line when the world loses balance. I'm Don, a police officer, instructor, and founder of Forecast Securities Group, and I'll be your guide through the storm. Welcome to the Conditions Report. I'm Don, and this is the Conditions Report. If you've already been listening to the show, you know the premise. And if you're new here, here's what you need to know. This is the weather forecast for street cops, detectives, and admin. What's coming, what's changing in the environment that we work in. And before we go any further, a quick disclaimer. I'm not an attorney, and nothing discussed on this show is legal advice. I'm not speaking on behalf of any government agency or law enforcement agency. The views expressed here are those exclusively of Forecast Securities Group and myself, and they're an exercise of protected American free speech. If you need legal advice or guidance specific to your agency or jurisdiction, you should consult a qualified attorney. Lastly, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only, and we're not here to judge the officers involved in these incidences or to second guess their decisions with the benefit of hindsight. The point here is to learn from their hard-earned lessons on our behalf and improve as a team. Let's get into the episode summary. This episode is about misunderstanding rather than malice. It examines how officers, supervisors, and institutions can act with sincere intentions and still violate the Fourth Amendment by confusing one form of authority for another. The Constitution recognizes different categories of police authority. Caretaking authority is not emergency authority. Emergency authority is not investigative authority, and each category exists for specific purpose under those specific conditions with specific limits. When those categories blur, constitutional violations follow, even when no one believes they're overstepping. To understand why this happens so consistently, the episode looks beyond policing into history. Some of the most destructive leaders of the 20th century did not gain influence through chaos or cruelty alone. They gained power by offering a certainty when moments were unnerving or intolerable. Adolf Hitler rose in a Germany destabilized by defeat in the First World War, hyperinflation, political fragmentation, and widespread social resentment. His appeal rested less on the detailed policy competence and more on a narrative of coherence. He offered a single explanation that accounted for military defeat, economic suffering, and a cultural anxiety. That explanation identified causes, enemies, and solutions with confidence. Once accepted, disagreement no longer felt like an inquiry. It felt like denial of reality. Institutions gradually aligned themselves with that certainty, measuring competence by ideological conformity rather than independent judgment. Joseph Stalin consolidated power through control of structure rather than rhetoric. As a general secretary of the Communist Party, he controlled appointments, promotions, and access to decision-making roles. Loyalty to the party doctrine became the pathway to advancement. Reporting systems rewarded confirmation rather than accuracy. Agricultural output, figures, industrial quotas, and political assessments were shaped to meet the expectations rather than describe conditions. And over time, disagreement stopped appearing as dissent and began appearing as incompetence or sabotage. Belief became embedded in procedure, and the system operated without needing persuasion. Mao governed through ideological certainty rooted in a Marxist historical theory. During the Great Leap Forward, officials were pressured to meet production targets that were physically impossible. When crops failed and famine was widespread, local offices overstated yields and understated loss. Those distortions were not simple lies. They were adaptations to a system that punished contradiction. Accurate information became incompatible with survival instincts to the bureaucracy. Tens of millions died not because leaders lacked data, but because the belief filtered what information could travel upwards. These figures were not powerful because they were correct. They were powerful because certainty closed systems to correction. The Constitution reflects an understanding of that same human vulnerability. It does not assume bad intent. It assumes that confidence, especially under pressure, can lead people to stop asking which authority actually applies. This episode uses 4 fundamental cases to show how the court has drawn careful lines between different kinds of police authority, and why getting those categories wrong is where the constitutional violations usually begin. Let's get into the situation brief. Most constitutional violations in policing do not begin with disregard for the law. They begin with misclassification of a situation. Officers are trained to act. They're trained to intervene, to help, to prevent harm. Welfare checks, mental health calls, the community complaints arrive carrying emotional weight. Before they arrive carrying clarity. In those moments, hesitation feels irresponsible, and it feels like waiting is a risk. That pressure produces a predictable mental outcome. Concerns begin to feel like urgency. Responsibility begins to feel like permission. The situation feels serious, so authority is assumed to be broad. The intent feels protective, so the legal justification feels self-evident. It's not reckless. This is a human pattern recognition under stress. The problem is that the law does not operate on feelings. It operates on categories. Caretaking authority exists to manage public-facing risk. Emergency aid authority exists to address imminent harm to life. And exigent circumstances exist to prevent the loss of crucial evidence or escape of suspects. Investigative authority exists to enforce criminal law. Each category answers a different problem. Each authorizes different action, and none substitute for the other. When those distinctions are blurred, officers do not feel like they're overstepping. They feel like they're standing on solid ground. Confidence fills the space where classification should be. Belief takes the place of articulation. And history shows what happens when systems stop correcting that tendency. Large systems fail when belief becomes a substitute for verification. Smaller systems are vulnerable to the same failure mode, and the Fourth Amendment exists to prevent that closure. It forces officers to name authorities that they are using and justify why they apply under the conditions present at the time. The cases that follow exist to enforce that same discipline. So let's get into the current conditions. The community caretaking doctrine enters constitutional law through a narrow set of facts. In the case Cady v. Dombrowski, 1973, a Chicago police officer named Dombrowski crashed a rented Ford automobile on a rural Wisconsin highway. He had been drinking, the vehicle was disabled, and towed several miles away to a privately owned garage. It was left outside, unguarded, and accessible to the public. Dombrowski was arrested for operating while intoxicated and later became incapacitated. He was unable to make arrangements to secure the vehicle, and he had identified himself as a Chicago police officer. The Wisconsin officers were well aware that Chicago police officers were required to carry service revolvers at all times. Officers believed that Dombrowski's service revolver was still inside the vehicle, and their concern was that a loaded firearm could be easily accessible to the public. The following morning, an officer conducted a warrantless search of the vehicle, specifically looking for the revolver. The officer searched the trunk where police weapons were often stored, and he did not find a firearm. He did, however, find blood-stained items that would later connect Dombrowski to a homicide. Those items were introduced at trial, and Dombrowski challenged the search as a violation of the Fourth Amendment. The Supreme Court upheld the search. Justice Rehnquist emphasized that local police officers frequently engage in community caretaking functions that are, quote-unquote, totally divorced from the detection, investigation, or acquisition of evidence related to the violation of criminal statute, unquote. The search was justified by a concrete public safety concern involving a vehicle already in police custody, accessible to the public, and believed to contain a dangerous item. The holding was narrow, and it rested on the nature of automobiles, the public setting, and the incapacitation of the owner, and the specific safety risk presented. The court did not create a general warrantless search authority. It recognized a limited caretaking function tied to environmental risk. That brings us to South Dakota v. Opperman, 1976. In South Dakota v. Opperman, the court addressed a different but related issue. Opperman's automobile was parked in downtown Vermillion, South Dakota. It was accumulating multiple parking citations, and after repeated violations, the vehicle was lawfully impounded and towed to a city impound lot. Opperman was not present at the time of the impoundment, And once the vehicle was in police custody, officers conducted an inventory search pursuant to the standardized police procedures. The purpose of the inventory was administrative. Officers documented contents of the vehicle to protect the owner's property, to protect the police from claims or loss of theft, and to protect the public from potential hazards. During the inventory, officers opened an unlocked glove compartment and discovered marijuana. The Supreme Court upheld the search. The court emphasized that inventory searches are justified by caretaking functions rather than criminal investigation. The vehicle was lawfully impounded, and the search followed standardized procedure. The purpose was administrative, not investigatory. The court again relied on the diminished expectation of privacy in automobiles and the public-facing risks associated with vehicles in a police custody. Cady and Opperman share critical limitations. Both involve vehicles, both involve lawful custody, and both involve public access and standardized procedure. Neither case authorizes warrantless entry into a home. Let's flash forward to Caniglia v. Strom, 2021. Police responded to a domestic dispute involving Caniglia and his wife. During the argument, Caniglia placed a handgun on the table and made statements suggesting self-harm. Officers did not arrest him, they did not observe any violence, and they did not witness an emergency that was unfolding. Officers persuaded Caniglia to go to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. He went voluntarily, and after he left, officers entered the home without a warrant and seized firearms, citing community caretaking concerns. The First Circuit upheld the entry, reasoning that police have general caretaking responsibility to protect individuals from harm, even inside a home. But the Supreme Court unanimously reversed. Chief Justice Roberts held that community caretaking doctrine recognized in Cady does not justify warrantless entry into a home. What is reasonable for vehicles is not reasonable for homes. The home sits at the core of the Fourth Amendment. The court clarified that officers may still enter without a warrant under doctrine designed for homes, such as emergency aid or exigent circumstances. What is rejected was the idea that caretaking alone could justify entry into a private residence. Brigham City v. Stuart illustrates what lawful warrantless entry into a home would look like when the facts support it. Officers respond to a noise complaint early in the morning. As they approached the house, they heard shouting. They looked through a window and observed a physical altercation involving several adults and a juvenile. They saw the juvenile break free and strike an adult in the face, causing blood to be spit into a sink. Officers entered the home without a warrant and intervened. The Supreme Court upheld this entry. The court held that officers may enter a home without a warrant when they have an objectively reasonable basis to believe an occupant is seriously or immediately threatened with a serious injury. The justification was emergency aid. The facts were visible, harm was unfolding, and delay would have served no purpose. This was not a caretaking action. It was emergency authority grounded in observable immediate danger. Taken together, these cases draw a clear boundary. Authority depends on the context. Doctrine depends on the facts, and acting under the wrong category, even with good intentions, produces constitutional error. That brings us to today's leadership navigational aid. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. Nietzsche isn't quoted here because he was an edgy or provocative figure. He's quoted because he spent his life studying how people come to believe that they're right, and what that belief does once it hardens. He was a 19th century philosopher who watched institutions, churches, states, and moral systems collapse under the weight of their own certainty. His work wasn't about abstract truth. It was about human behavior inside systems of authority. What he noticed was simple and uncomfortable. When someone is lying, they know they're exposed. You can usually see it in how they behave. They hedge. They qualify. They change their answer depending on who's asking, and lying takes effort because a person knows they might get challenged. Conviction doesn't behave that way. When someone is convinced that they're right, the way they speak changes. They stop walking through their thinking and start delivering conclusions. Answers come out finished. There's no pause to reconsider, no room left open for follow-up, and the conversation moves on before anyone really has a chance to sit with what was said. Questions become opposition and defiance, and they are seen as obstacles to efficiency. You can watch this happen inside organizations all over the world. A leader makes a call and does it with confidence. People nod, sometimes out of fear, Other times, pushing back feels unnecessary. The meeting ends quicker than expected, and the obvious follow-up never gets addressed. That's the risk that Nietzsche was warning about. Not dishonesty, not corruption, but certainty. History gives us that pattern in scale. In Germany, once a single explanation for national failure took hold, institutions stopped questioning. In the Soviet Union, once party doctrine became the measure of correctness, accurate reporting became dangerous. And in China, once the theory mattered more than observation, bad outcomes were explained away instead of corrected. None of this happened because people were unintelligent. It happened because confidence went unchallenged for long enough, and that same dynamic shows up in leadership closer to home. At some point, leaders have to ask whether they're actually current, or if their experience is still even relevant. Are we reading the law as it exists now? Are we relying on what we learned years ago? Do we know where the case law sits today? Are we tracking legislative changes and professional standards as they shift, or assuming the rules haven't moved much? The same question applies to self-assessment, myself included. Are calls being debriefed in a way that actually tests the authority and limits, or are we just confirming that the outcome worked out in our favor? Are our decisions truly being examined? There's another layer underneath this that doesn't get much attention. A lot of people in leadership roles haven't truly engaged with the job in years. They don't take calls anymore. They don't wear body cameras. They don't carry equipment that policy says they're required to have. No magazines, no tourniquets, no radio, no vest, no operating under the constraints that they themselves dictate. Yet, they still carry a gun. They still drive a take-home car. They still hold peace officer authority, and the decisions they make shape how other officers are expected to operate in real time under scrutiny that they no longer face. This is a serious disconnect. Authority without contact with the work goes stale. Knowledge without maintenance erodes. The job changes. The law changes. Expectations change. If you're not close enough to feel that shift, you don't notice when your confidence stops matching reality. What you end up with is people who look like leaders but no longer understand the terrain they're in. They're essentially playing dress up, wearing a quote-unquote police costume with no context for the real job. That's a dangerous game to be playing because decisions are being made on outdated information. Policies get enforced that don't reflect the current law. Expectation gets set that doesn't survive real-world conditions. And when things go wrong, the people that make the calls are often furthest away from the real consequences. Leadership doesn't require doing the job every day, but it does require staying fluent in the language, reading the law, tracking the changes, testing assumptions against how the work actually looks now. That's why Nietzsche still matters here. He wasn't warning about evil people. He was warning about the confident ones. That brings us to the extended forecast. Welfare checks, mental health calls, and community safety responses will continue to test officer ability to classify authority correctly. Courts are increasingly focused on articulation rather than intent. Scrutiny is moving earlier in the timeline. What facts were present, what authority was invoked, and what authority applied rather than another. Agencies that treat caretaking as a general permission will continue losing cases, and agencies that train officers to slow down, name the doctrine they are relying on, will adapt. The future favors precision. As we close, let's remember, the point of this show is not to pass judgment or to revisit decisions with the benefit of hindsight. It's to learn as a team and improve. We're all leaders, so keep the LNA in the back of your mind. The work is complicated, the environment is demanding, and none of us get it perfect. Stay hungry, stay humble. I'm Don, and this has been the Conditions Report. Be the calm in the storm, clarity in confusion, and always influence the weather.